welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and this week I talked about the world of shipping and climate change with Simon Bullock, a climate researcher from the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester. In April this year, the International Maritime Organisation, or IMO, the main regulatory body for global shipping, agreed to charging ships for the greenhouse gases they emitted. But some experts are unconvinced that the recent agreement is strong enough to meet climate goals.
But it will take at least a decade for them to be deployed at scale, because you've got to build the port infrastructure, the fuel infrastructure, you've got to build the ships as well. This all takes time. But time is what we don't have with climate change.
Simon Bullock attended that recent IMO meeting, and I began by asking him to explain why shipping is so important for climate change.
Almost everything you'll have in your home, whether it's computers or clothes or food or furniture, it comes to us at least part of the way by ship. The world's economies are pretty much reliant on international shipping. But the problem here is that almost all of the world's 90,000 odd ships are powered by highly polluting fuel oils. So because it's such a vast global sector, the total pollution is quite high. So shipping's carbon dioxide emissions are around those of a country like Germany. And that's all adding to the blanket of pollution in the Earth's atmosphere, trapping more of the sun's energy, heating up our planet. Shipping's important to us all, but it also has a climate pollution problem, and it's urgent we try and find ways of sorting that out.
The predictions are that in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the 2040s and 50s, that at least the proportion of emissions that it contributes is going to rise. Is that right?
Yeah. It's about 3% now. It could rise to be higher as other countries and other sectors decarbonise, like we're starting to see the power sectors having fewer emissions, road sector as EVs come online. If shipping continues on its current trend, its high contribution now will get worse.
Why do you think that progress on shipping decarbonisation has been so slow?
It's a complex global problem. Most climate emissions and most climate change strategies are run nationally. So the British or the American or the Indian governments will say, we have responsibility for our power sector or our road sector, so we can set policies for that. International shipping is different because obviously it's a global sector. Most ships are spending most of their time on international waters. The regulation and control of that sector is more complicated than just road transport or steel. The International Maritime Organisation is a United Nations body that's been charged with setting the global regulatory framework for shipping. So most nations are part of that, and the IMO prefers to take its decisions on a consensus basis rather than straight out voting. Climate change has only really been a focus of the IMO for the last 10 years or so. Before that, it focused on things like rules to prevent oil spills after the Exxon Valdez disaster in the Torrey Canyon. And more recently, in the last 10 years or so, it's focused on getting sulfur out of fuels to help reduce local air pollution. Climate change is a relatively new thing for the IMO. Efficiency standards in the 2010s, first climate change strategy in 2018, but that was pretty weak, had some weak targets, very few policies. The breakthrough was 2 years ago in 2023 when they set a more ambitious strategy. And that said that they should cut shipping's emissions by 30% by 2030, 80% by 2040, en route to zero by 2050. That's setting the targets. And this year in April, there was a big meeting to decide on which policies to meet those targets. The main thing they agreed was a fuel standard. Ships will have to meet a standard for the carbon intensity of the fuel that they use. So increasingly it has to have less carbon in it over time. The penalties get higher over time, effectively a carbon price. That should incentivize investment in greener ships. But the problem is that the IMO, it has an awful lot of players within it. Some are quite progressive on climate change, others are much less so. The deal that was agreed in April, although you could say from a pragmatic point of view, getting any sort of global deal is a success, given the state of global geopolitics right now. And the end result's always going to be a compromise, given the divergent views. You could say nothing could have been agreed. By that reckoning, any sort of measure is a good thing. But if you look at it objectively, the policies that they've agreed, both on fuel standard and on energy efficiency in ships, only get us to around 10% cuts by 2030, not the 30% that are actually in the IMO's own strategy. Overall, nowhere near good enough. I think the other point I would make about it is that it's not very well aligned with the IMO's other main target, which was for a just and fair transition, so fair to developing nations. So it's not clear how the revenue from this new carbon price in shipping is going to be distributed. And it needs to flow to poorer countries because they tend to have older, more polluting ships. The revenue from these measures should be going to the developing countries, but it's not clear that that will happen yet. I think both on climate grounds and on fairness grounds, what the IMO have agreed is just not enough. The Americans are not particularly interested in the IMO's measures right now under the new Trump administration because they don't want to see anything introduced globally that might affect US short-term economic interests. Saudi Arabia and the petrostates were very strong blockers of stronger measures at IMO because they've got a lot to lose economically in a world using trading and shipping less fossil fuel. So they're predictably forces for delay. China isn't a positive force either, neither is Brazil. Consistently, the strongest voices for faster action are the Pacific nations, very well organized, coherent, robust in their interventions. They don't have as much political power as the other nations. The United Kingdom was strong too this year on energy efficiency, with a lot of nations who are delaying and only a few nations like the Pacific nations and the UK being more progressive. What the middle countries do is really important. Which way do they swing? And traditionally, the European Union have been pretty good, but this time around, this year, they were very disappointing in the IMO. They started with a weak negotiating position and they didn't move very much away from it.
And why do you think that was? You wrote about that previously, saying they had a fairly weak position. What do you think happened?
Perhaps it's because there's a general slight shift away from progressive action in the EU. I think 5 years ago they were doing quite a lot. Things have shifted a little bit. And I'm hopeful that the EU would be more progressive in future. It's ironic, actually, because 5 years ago, the EU were one of the strongest voices saying that the IMO are just not taking sufficient action on climate change and shipping. Therefore, we, the EU, will introduce our own policies, which they have done. They've brought shipping into the EU emissions trading scheme. They've brought in a policy called Fuel EU, which does a similar thing to what IMO have just done to bring in a fuel standard. Those policies weren't perfect, but they were ahead of the IMO and quite strong in lots of ways. I mean, they could have been more ambitious, but 5 years ago, I think the EU were pushing the IMO to go faster, and now it feels that the EU is not doing as much as it was, and that's a shame.
What was agreed in April this year by the International Maritime Organisation? So you see it as quite inadequate. Is that part of the nature of international negotiations? We've seen quite a lot of disappointments with COP climate negotiations. Is there a way the IMO could not be responsible for these kinds of climate fighting measures? Or is there any other way that this could be done?
What's needed in shipping is an integrated patchwork of policies at national level, at international level, and EU regional level that work together so that you don't have duplicating bureaucratic extra regulation where things are double counted. But it does require action at all levels, and it requires unilateral, bilateral agreements between shipping companies and charterers. They could introduce climate change clauses into contracts. The world's big retailers like Amazon, IKEA, and Walmart, some of the biggest customers for the shipping industry, they're going to come under increasing public pressure to act on climate, which would include their shipping emissions. You could see scope for action happening at lots of levels. It's unrealistic to think that action just at the IMO level will ever be sufficient. Similarly, I don't think that you can really solve this problem without the IMO. I think you do need to have some global regulation and standards to at least have a lowest bar that everybody has to attain. And then hopefully the front runners will move faster and drag everybody up over time. Some countries and some nations have done really positive things, and some parts of the industry also have. There's been a big growth in the last couple of years in wind assist shipping. So not totally going back to sails, but if you put various types of sails or kites or Flettner rotors onto ships, you can save about 20% of fuel, which is a really big deal. If you did that with lots of other little measures as well, it soon adds up. The other thing to say about shipping is that compared with other sectors like aviation is that there does seem to be a lot of goodwill and people who are prepared to act. Obviously, there are laggards and people who delay. But when I look at shipping compared to aviation, where aviation, all I see is greenwashing, delay and denial, I think shipping is in a better place. There are more proactive people who are actually doing things.
And why do you think that is, actually? Why do you think there's this contrast between aviation and shipping?
I don't know the aviation industry very well from actually nuts and bolts on the ground, but I'm always very impressed with the shipping industry about their can-do attitude to just getting things done. So I've just been involved in a project up in Aberdeen, Scotland, around installing shore power there. So shore power is where ships can connect up to local grids while they're in port, so they don't have to have their engines on. So it's good for local air pollution. And just seeing the attitude towards getting that project done, because it may seem simple, you just plug a ship in, but actually these are complicated projects, both technically and financially, getting a business case right. But the attitude there, both from the port and from the shipping operators, is, well, we just need to get this done, don't we? There are problems and barriers, and we're going to work our way through them, rather than the opposite mentality, which might have been to go throw your hands up and go, we can't do anything until we are helped or forced by somebody else. So, yeah, maybe there's more of a can-do attitude. It's a cultural thing.
Is it right that China's the biggest commercial ship manufacturer in the world and has market dominance? Is that correct?
There are three nations who control almost all of shipbuilding, which is China, Japan, and South Korea. And there are other places to do smaller amounts, like Scandinavian countries and Turkey, but it's mostly that part of Asia which builds most of the ships.
Looking at those three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, how are they doing on improving emissions and ship efficiency?
Mostly shipyards, wherever they are, will react to whatever they're asked to build. There are an awful lot of ships being built right now which are what's called dual fuel ready. In the long term, ships will stop using heavy fuel oil or marine fuel oils and use alternative fuels such as ammonia and methanol and biofuels, hydrogen and the like. Which ones will dominate is not clear yet. But in the meantime, what's happening is that ships are being ordered to run on two fuels. So at the moment, they'll run on heavy fuel oils, but they're designed so that they can switch to alternative fuels in the future. Right now, even if you wanted to run your ship on ammonia, there isn't the supply of green ammonia in particular, because you can make ammonia in dirty ways or clean ways. There isn't a lot of green ammonia around, so they have to wait. And for me, that's a really important point in shipping, is that a lot of the focus from everyone is on these new fuels, ammonia, methanol, and the like. But it will take at least a decade for them to be deployed at scale, because you've got to build the port infrastructure, the fuel infrastructure, you've got to build the ships as well. This all takes time. But time is what we don't have with climate change. So we've got to act. We really need to cut emissions quite deeply in the next 5 years. So I'm not saying don't focus on these new fueled ships, but you have to do something as well to deal with the emission problem we have right now. So I think that energy efficiency, employing things like wind assist technologies and shore power, route optimization, slower speeds, these are all things that can cut emissions in the near term while we're waiting for these new fuels to come on board. That's why my shipping research group, the Tyndall Centre, is focused pretty much entirely on the problem of short-term emissions reductions. So we leave the fuel stuff to other people, because we think there's enough focus and attention on that part of the problem. And what's more important right now is to have more people working on energy efficiency and emissions right now. The industry have said, well, the IMO has said, cut emissions by 30% by 2030. There are three broad baskets of things you can do to cut emissions in shipping. The first is around demand, ship less stuff, shorter distances. And that will happen in future, because for some segments, because currently around a third of the world's shipping is shipping coal, oil and gas around. And hopefully we'll be doing a lot less of that if the world is serious about tackling climate change. So that's the first thing, is demand. Second thing is energy efficiency. Whatever you've got a ship, do it in the most energy efficient way possible. Ships' fuel consumption is proportional to velocity squared. If you slow it down even by a couple of knots, that makes a big difference. Route optimization is another thing that has become much more in vogue in recent years because of big data and greater understanding of how weather and tides, waves and the like work. So you can route optimize to save energy. You can also save energy by putting sails on. You can use energy saving technologies on the ship around the propeller being more efficient, the hull being more efficient, the engine being more efficient. All of these sorts of things, so speed, energy efficiency, route optimization, sails, they can get you quite a long way. They can meet the IMO's 30% by 2030 target almost entirely on their own without any need for new fuels. while we deploy new fuels in the 2030s at scale. So we obviously need to be doing some stuff now with the new ships, but realistically, we just can't retrofit a global fleet of 90,000 ships that quickly. It takes time, and the new ships take time to filter through into the fleet. Ammonia, methanol, biofuels will take longer. Two things are important for the new fuels debate, which actually strengthen the argument for energy efficiency. The first is that all of these fuels have problems with them. So ammonia is really toxic and dangerous. Massive problems with biofuels, sustainability, scalability. Methanol still emits carbon when you burn it, so does LNG. So it's the production methods there that matter. So all of these fuels doesn't feel like there's a silver bullet. And all of them are going to be more expensive than what we've got at the moment and scarce. So everything that you can do to reduce the amount of these new fuels that you need helps, because it means the scale of the problem that you're trying to deal with is smaller. So I think that's why it's like a double benefit for energy efficiency stuff. Not only does it cut climate emissions now, but it makes the rest of the problem easier to solve.
You sound fairly optimistic about the big commercial players taking up more fuel efficient. How do you feel about it?
I swing from day to day, really. Some days there's good news on climate, other days it's terrible, isn't it? The pressure to act on climate change, the public pressure on politicians and firms is only going to increase as climate damage gets worse. And it is going to get worse. It's just really upsetting and sad fact about the climate change situation we're in, that until we get to zero emissions, climate change is going to get worse. And the only benefit from that is that as that happens, that may make the politicians' pressure that they face sufficiently strong that it becomes untenable to keep on doing so little.
It does feel like shipping is slightly opaque as an industry. Do you think that there's any prospect of better accountability or transparency in shipping? For example, the IMO isn't particularly transparent organisation, or you might think it is.
Not particularly. I mean, they share quite a lot of documents on their website if you're accredited to see their documents. As a good example of this, the meeting in April, there was a big debate about to what level of public accessibility would there be to their emissions reporting data. And there was progress on that, but not as much as there could have been. And that it's the old wrangle between people going, no, this is commercially sensitive data, we shouldn't be giving it out to anybody, and people going, the more you put this data in the public domain, the better informed we'll all be and the more efficient choices we'll make. So it's an ongoing issue within the IMO. I think the other point you raise is that the shipping is opaque to people generally, isn't it? I mean, most of its activities are out at sea. You don't see it in the same way as you do see lorries or planes or trains. Yeah, it is more out of sight, out of mind, isn't it? COVID-19 and Brexit made people more aware of just how important the port sector was to the British economy, seeing the problems by both of those issues that were created for the UK. It made people realise, oh yeah, we are pretty reliant on ports and shipping. This stuff doesn't just magically appear. There's a really complex global industry supporting everything. It's harder to shine a spotlight on the shipping industry, certainly, than it is for other sectors.
And if there were key countries which need to evolve and change and could actually influence, particularly negotiations at an IMO level, who would they be?
Stronger positions from the big players, EU, China, Japan, the States, Brazil. Yeah, they're all important. There are more of the African and Caribbean nations being involved in a progressive way. And I think that was really good to see as well. The climate vulnerable nations do a good job of highlighting just how important action on climate change is within the shipping sector. I hope the more progressive voices will join them.
Are there any quite obvious impacts that there may be in the coming years that might impact on commercial shipping itself?
Yes, I think a couple of bodies are looking into studies into this. But I think the two main ones are that you will have more severe and extreme weather events at sea under climate change. So it will become, in general, more dangerous and risky for seafarers and crew than it was. I think the other big issue is for ports. As sea levels rise, then lots of that infrastructure wasn't designed around sea level rise. So it'll become expensive and difficult for many, particularly the older ports, to cope with that. So yeah, weather events at sea and ports.
My thanks to Simon Bullock for his time. As usual, Simon has provided some further reading on this topic, which you can find in the podcast blurb or on our website. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show, and Bertie will be back with another interview in a few weeks' time. I'm Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.